My daughter called me 3 times the night she died. I remember the order of it better than I remember the numbers on my own mailbox. That's how grief works. It burns some details into your brain like carvings in wet concrete. I was stuck in a boardroom that smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink, sitting through a budget meeting that nobody cared about except the people who wanted to climb another rung on the ladder. Sophie's name lit up my phone once, then twice, then 3 times, and I let everyone go to voicemail. The first message was so ordinary it hurts to think about now. She sounded bright, upbeat. "Hey Dad, you wanna grab dinner? There's a place over on H Street I've been dying to try. Oh, and that movie's out this weekend, the one I kept bugging you about." Her voice had that hum in it, the hum she always had when she was excited about something, usually some weird discovery at work. She made things sound important, even if they were just leftovers or old maps. At the time, I smiled to myself, thinking I'd call her back after the meeting. It was supposed to be just another day. The second message came about an hour later, and the tone couldn't have been more different. Her voice was tight, low. You can hear when someone is looking over their shoulder even if you can't see them. "Dad, I found something at work. I don't think I was supposed to. Please call me when you're free. I need to talk to someone I trust." She didn't ramble, she didn't joke. Sophie always joked, even when she was nervous. This wasn't nervous, this was scared. That was when I should have excused myself from the meeting, but I didn't. I sat there with a fake smile and a pen in my hand, pretending to care about numbers in a slide deck. The third voicemail wasn't really a message at all. It was just breathing. 37 seconds of harsh, shallow breathing. Like she'd been running, like something was behind her. Halfway through, the sound shifted. There was a scrape like her phone had dragged against stone, and then muffled barely there, one single word, "Mammoth." After that, nothing. The line cut. By the time I finally walked out of the meeting and listened, Sophie was already dead. The cops said it was a single-car accident. She'd been driving too fast on New York Avenue NE, veered into a stone wall, no skid marks, no brake lights. Instant. But Sophie wasn't reckless. She didn't drink. She double-checked locks, carried pepper spray, reminded me to buckle my seatbelt like I was the kid. The Sophie I knew didn't just crash. At the funeral, people whispered condolences. Friends from college, a couple colleagues from the Smithsonian Support Center. A priest said something about faith, but it washed over me like static. Because all I could hear, again and again, was that third voicemail, the scrape of stone, the breath like she was running for her life, and that one word whispered through the static. Mammoth. That night I sat in her apartment surrounded by her books and her notes, trying not to break down. On her desk, under a stack of folders, I found a single word scribbled in her neat handwriting, Atlas, and beneath it coordinates. My daughter had been cataloging something she wasn't supposed to find, an atlas older than the country itself. And somehow it pointed to 7 thin places in the U.S., but only one was still open, the one she called out with her last breath, Mammoth. Grief makes you do strange things. Some people drink. Some bury themselves in work. Me. I pulled every professional favor I'd earned in 20 years. I'd been a freelance collections consultant for most of my adult life, specializing in old documents, field notes, colonial surveys, maps scribbled by men who barely survived the journeys they recorded. The Smithsonian had hired me plenty of times, enough that I knew which forms to file, which extensions to call, and which names to drop in a polite email. 3 days after Sophie's funeral, I walked into the Smithsonian Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, a place most people don't even know exists. From the outside, it looks like an anonymous government warehouse. Inside, it's the beating heart of America's memory. Millions of artifacts and documents stacked floor to ceiling, row on row, in chilled vaults that smell of paper, dust, and the faint metallic tang of history. It's the kind of place Sophie loved, and the kind of place where she'd found something that got her killed. A registrar named Halloran, thin and tired, met me at the gate. He recognized my name and badge, though I could tell by his eyes that he also recognized the loss written all over me. She was working sub-level F, he said quietly, after leading me past security doors and endless aisles of archival boxes. Colonial survey intake. We've had irregularities in the log since she died. Define irregularities, I asked. He shifted uncomfortably. Boxes checked in two places at once, video feeds looping, references to items we don't officially have. That was enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Sophie's workstation was still intact. A steel table, blue mat, a magnifying lamp, and stacks of manila folders. Her coffee mug sat on the desk like she might be back any second. On the mat under an acrylic cover lay the vellum roll that had changed everything. Even under plastic, I could tell it was old. Not just museum old. Revolutionary old. The vellum was labeled in small, cramped script. Atlas of subterraneous passages and adits of a certain character. 1776-79. It wasn't an atlas the way we think of atlases. No polished engravings or grand coastlines. This was a field manual. Rough sketches of limestone caverns, drip measurements, airflow notes, the practical handwriting of men mapping darkness with lanterns and fear. Most of the sheets showed standard mining symbols of the time, but some had strange markings, bent stars, spirals, sigils carved at intersections. Along the margins, single words, wrath, envy, gluttony. The handwriting shifted between neat surveyor's script and a second, more frantic style. One page noted, passages align with spiritual territories, 7 known, 6 bound. And there, in Sophie's careful pencil, were modern annotation, decimal degrees, GPS conversions, cross-references to WPA documents from the 1930s. She translated 18th century bearings into 21st century coordinates. Halloran lowered his voice. That document wasn't logged in our system. Sophie found it tucked into a WPA intake box. She said it didn't belong, but she couldn't stop working on it. I snapped photos of every page. My historian's gut told me this wasn't a theological doodle or an allegory. It was practical, a map you could follow with your boots. And at the back, underlined twice in Sophie's handwriting, was a single word, Mammoth. Her Smithsonian laptop was still logged in. A folder on the desktop read, Descent Protocol. Inside were survival checklists, climbing harness, headlamps, trauma kits, rations. My cautious, meticulous daughter had been preparing for something big, something underground. Another folder, Thin Places, U.S. It listed 7 locations. 6 were marked sealed between 1937 and 1941. The 7th read, Mammoth, Edge open, Custodian none. That third voicemail echoed in my ears. Mammoth. I pulled the coordinates into Google Earth that night in a cheap motel, watching the map of Kentucky shift under my cursor. The point landed not inside the tourist portion of Mammoth Cave National Park, but just outside in scrubland on the park's edge. And there, cross-referenced in Sophie's notes, was a 1938 WPA project file, Flood control shaft abandoned. A shaft, poured concrete, spiral steps leading down. The kind of place Sophie would have gone chasing answers. The kind of place you might call with your last breath when the dark was already closing in. The WPA paperwork had called it a flood control shaft. But standing there in person, I knew that was a lie. I'd driven 2 hours south of Louisville, past billboard promises of authentic caves and roadside stands selling homemade fudge, until the paved road turned to gravel and then to weeds. My GPS stuttered and died 3 miles out, like it wanted no part of this. The shaft sat in a clearing of scrub and limestone outcrops, fenced once but long since left to rot. A concrete ring jutted from the earth like the lip of a well, its surface weathered but intact. Iron hinges still clung to one side, though the grate they'd held was long gone. No sign of water management, no channels, no spillways, no pump house foundations. Just a hole. And carved into that lip, half buried under moss and lichen, were markings. Not the initials of bored kids, not the scratches of animals. These were deliberate. I leaned closer, brushing away the moss with a gloved hand. The marks weren't random. They formed a pattern I'd seen before, but not in engineering manuals or WPA blueprints. They matched the symbols on 18th-century grave slabs in New England, sigils carved by colonial masons to ward off evil. I'd studied them once for a paper. Compass roses bent inward, spirals that folded back on themselves, stars with points curled like fists. They weren't decorations, they were warnings. The men who built this shaft hadn't been worried about floods. They'd been worried about something else, something underground. I thought of Sophie's annotations in the atlas, the frantic pencil notes in her careful hand. US 7 sites, 6 sealed, 1 open. And this was it. The shaft was a plug, not a drain, a door disguised as public works. I rigged my climbing harness, clipped rope to an old steel eye set in the concrete rim, and tested my weight twice. The air that drifted up from below was cool and damp, laced with the mineral smell of deep stone. The first few steps down were poured concrete, WPA standard, but 20 feet in the handrail rusted away and the steps became something else, chisels on limestone worn smooth by time. Not government work, not 20th century at all. Fossilized shells winked from the stone, spirals caught forever mid-whirl, little echoes of an ocean that had died millions of years ago. I counted each step out of habit, my historian's brain cataloging distance the way Sophie would have. At 60 steps, the air pressed heavier. At 100, my ears popped. At 200, condensation slicked the walls. The WPA had built the upper ring, but deeper down I was walking the bones of the earth itself. The staircase ended abruptly at a landing of ancient limestone. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a chamber far older than any WPA project. In the floor, etched deep into the fossil bed, was the same inward-bent star I'd seen on the shaft lip, this time large enough to stand in. A sigil of binding, but one worn smooth, its grooves eroded by centuries. And beyond it yawned a seam in the stone. A dark slit that opened into blackness, the edges chipped with the same colonial sigils, now broken and flaking. Sophie's notes had called this place by a single word, threshold. I lifted my headlamp. Its beam vanished into the seam like light swallowed whole. The map said this was where the ordinary world ended, and something else began. The landing widened into a cavern that didn't belong to Kentucky, or anywhere I'd ever seen. 7 tunnels opened in the stone wall ahead of me, mouths carved into the limestone like a broken grin. Each was crowned with an emblem so unmistakably American it made my chest tighten, yet each one was wrong. Above the first tunnel, a rattlesnake coiled like the Gadsden flag, except its rattle was a rosary of teeth. Above the second, the federal shield, but the stripes dripped downward into jagged arrows that pointed back at the viewer. The third bore a buffalo, the kind stamped on nickels, but its face turned toward me, eyes too human, mouth curled in a sneer. Others showed wheat stalks twisted into clutching hands, an eagle whose wings bent like broken arms, even the Liberty Bell with a crack so deep it gaped like a screaming mouth. 7 tunnels, 7 emblems, 7 sins dressed in the clothes of my country. I didn't need Sophie's notes to tell me what they were. Wrath, envy, gluttony, greed, pride, sloth, lust. This wasn't a cave system. This was an architecture of morality carved in stone, and I had already crossed its threshold. The air inside the cavern was heavy, the kind of silence that pushes on your ears until you hear your own pulse. I swept my headlamp across the chamber, counting slow. My boots scuffed fossil beds, tiny shells long dead underfoot. That was when I heard it, voices. Not echoes, not the drip of cave water pretending to be words. Real voices carrying the cadence of men who had argued so long they no longer remembered why they were angry. The war was ours by right. One voice barked, rough with an accent that had seen both tobacco fields and gunpowder. By God, it ended in 65. Another snapped back, nasal and precise. And the Union held. A third, softer, but cutting through both. No, neither of you is right. It never ended. It just changed uniforms. My light found them then. 3 figures stood near the tunnel marked with the serpent. Their clothes were rags of blue and gray, torn and stained with dirt and rust-colored shadows that hadn't washed out in a century and a half. One wore the remains of a Union kepi. Another had the tattered gray of Confederate butternut. The third, a farmhand maybe, looked like he'd never made it home from whichever side had claimed him. Their eyes were black, not like demons in Sunday sermons, but like photographs too long exposed. Color burned away, only shadow left. They turned toward me as one not hostile but curious. The Union soldier stepped forward, saluting with a trembling hand. "A living man," he said, voice dry as oak leaves. "Tell us, did the war end? Who held the field at Antietam?" I blinked. Of all the questions in the world, that was the one they wanted answered. "It ended," said. My voice sounded strange, too loud in the hollow dark. "It ended in 1865. The Union won." The soldier's mouth fell open, relief softening his skeletal face. "I told you," he whispered. "I told you Lincoln would see it through." The Confederates spat on the stone floor, though no spit fell. "And yet the graves kept filling, didn't they? Tell me, stranger, did our sons ever stop fighting?" I couldn't answer him, not truthfully. The farmhand lifted a hand, still clutching what looked like a rusted musket barrel fused to his bones. "We've been standing here for decades, arguing the same battle. Time moves crooked down here. Sometimes I think the war never ended at all." Their voices hung in the air like damp smoke. I felt the weight of them, their need for resolution, their endless circling of a question no answer could ever satisfy. But I also felt something else. Recognition. The way they looked at me wasn't just curiosity, it was familiarity. The Union soldier stepped closer, tilting his head like he was studying me. "You're not the first," he said. "What do you mean?" My mouth was dry, the words sticking in my throat. "A girl passed this way, months ago maybe, breathing like you, carrying books and light. She asked for the tower." My stomach dropped. "What girl?" I asked, though I already knew. The farmhand's eyes glinted with a flicker of memory. Dark hair, spoke soft, but her words had weight. She walked the path of wrath. The Confederates sneered, but there was no malice in it, only weariness. If she went to the tower, she belongs to him now. The Union soldier laid a hand on my shoulder, as if he still remembered the warmth of comradeship. "If you mean to follow, stranger, you'd best be ready. No living soul comes back from wrath unchanged." My lamp shook in my hand, the beam dancing across the tunnel mouths. The snake's rattle grinned back at me. Sophie had been here, alive, breathing, just months ago, and she had gone deeper, toward the tower. The tunnel of wrath narrowed, then broke wide into a cavern so massive my headlamp beam died before it reached the far wall. And there it was, a river, but not water. The current moved slow and thick, the way syrup does when it's half frozen. Its surface glinted like tarnished copper. The smell hit first, metallic, sharp, the smell of old coins and raw blood left too long in air. Every ripple carried the color of pennies oxidized by centuries. Brown red, streaked green, glowing faintly like embers drowned in sludge. I crouched at the bank, stones cold under my palm. The current tugged at me without touching me like a magnet on bone. This wasn't a river meant to carry boats. This was a river meant to carry time. Something shifted in the mist across the water. A shape grew from the haze, upright, hunched, steady. The ferryman. He looked less like myth and more like a man crushed by work. Heavy cloak, hood low, shoulders bent. In his hands, a pole longer than a flagstaff, sunk deep into the knot water. At his side, a flat craft waited, broad as a barge, its wood warped but unrotted. When his voice came, it was like gravel stirred in a bucket. No coin, no gold, no trinket. I swallowed. My hand had already gone to my wallet out of instinct, like money mattered here. Then what? The ferryman tilted his head, hood shifting just enough for me to see the hollowness where a face might have been. Years. The words slid into my bones. I shook my head. I don't understand. He planted the pole harder into the current, stirring red ripples. Each crossing costs. You pay in years you would have lived, not all just enough. Enough to remind you that every step here is borrowed. My breath hitched. I thought of Sophie, her notes, her courage, walking this same path. Did she give away years she hadn't lived yet? Was she already paying the debt somewhere deeper? "How many?" I asked. My voice echoed like a boy's, small and desperate. 7. 7 years torn from me in an instant. My knees buckled at the thought, but what choice did I have? The current blocked everything. Sophie was beyond it. I stepped into the boat. The ferryman raised his pole. The craft drifted forward, gliding not on top but through the current like time itself carried us. With every foot my skin tightened, my back stiffened, hair tugged with gray. Not dramatic, not grotesque, just subtle, cruel, a quiet theft. By mid-crossing I already felt older. The river whispered as we moved, not in words but in memories. I saw Sophie as a child pressing seashells into my palm on the Jersey shore. I saw her at graduation, robe crooked, laughter fierce. I saw her calling me 3 times that last night. Each vision cost something. I felt it drain. 7 years gone, siphoned away as casually as toll money. The ferryman said nothing more, just pulled steady until the far bank rose from the mist. When the boat kissed stone again, I stepped off, knees aching more than before, breath shorter. My hands shook not just from fear but from age. I turned. The ferryman was already receding into the mist, boat vanishing back across the copper-red current. I stood on black stone, staring at the vista beyond. A city sprawled against the cavern wall, but it wasn't ruins, not temples, not anything ancient. It was modern, brick row houses, barbed wire, crumbling factories, neon flickering, streets carved with barricades. And from those streets came the sound, muzzle flashes strobing in the dark, bursts of automatic fire, the scream of sirens that had never existed in Mammoth Cave. The city of violence breathed in chaos. Every flicker of light was a shot. Every echo was a death. And somewhere beyond that war-zone skyline my daughter had walked. I pulled my collar high, steadied my breathing, and stepped forward into the firestorm. The city of violence stretched for what felt like miles, streets choked with the smoke of endless firefights, faceless figures locked in eternal gun battles, their bullets never running out, their wounds never closing. But at its heart rose the tower. It wasn't medieval stone nor steel and glass. It was both. A prison stitched together from every era of cruelty. Barred windows bristled like teeth. Floodlights swept facades that had no generators. Guard towers blinked with signal fires older than the country. And carved into the walls endless names. Each name carried a story etched like prison ledgers. Murderers who strangled their neighbors, torturers who wrote manuals, tyrants who starved nations. Their sins weren't whispered, they were cataloged. The walls were a filing system of damnation. Every few feet I saw frescoes burned into stone, lynchings, firing squads, massacres. Wrath preserved not as warning but as archive. The tower was less a prison than a ledger of blood. And somewhere inside it my daughter still breathed. The gates yawned wide, though no guard watched. I stepped into corridors stacked with iron bars. Cells stretched upward like hive chambers, each lit by a sickly glow. Inside, figures paced or screamed, shadows of the wrath they'd once embodied. One cell contained a conquistador, armor rusted but blade sharp, muttering in Castilian. Another, a man in a powdered wig, voice shrill as he recited trial verdicts over and over. Others were too modern. A general in camouflage, boots caked with dust, knuckles broken from beatings he'd given. The tower held every era, every cruelty, and it was organized, like Sophie's atlas, like an archive. At the top of a spiral ramp I found a section unmarked, and behind its bars a figure I knew. Sophie. She looked up at me through the gloom, thinner than she'd been in her last photos, face hollow but alive. Dad. Her voice cracked, and for a moment she was my little girl again. I ran to the bars. I thought you were God, I thought, but she shook her head violently. No, I'm not dead, not yet, but it's changing me. Her eyes glistened, and then the glisten spread, black spilling into the whites like ink dropped in water. I killed a man. Her voice trembled. He tried to stop me before I reached the tower. I don't even remember how I did it. 1 second he was shouting, the next he was gone, crushed, like the tower used me. No, I whispered. That's not you. That's this place. Her fingers dug into the bars. You don't understand. The tower makes you part of its record. Every step I take, every choice, I'm becoming another entry, another prisoner. I wanted to reach for her to pull her free, but the bars burned cold just an inch from my skin. The walls groaned. The air thickened. From the shadows at the far end of the corridor it emerged. The guardian. It wasn't human nor beast. It was both. Its body built from shackles, chains, and broken swords, its head a black executioner's hood that shifted as though filled with smoke. It carried no weapon because it didn't need one. Its fists were gallows knots. Its ribs were iron bars. Sophie staggered back in her cell, eyes wide. It won't let me go. None of them ever leave without a fight if you want me free. Her gaze locked on mine. You'll have to defeat it. The guardian moved closer, chains dragging, each clink echoing like a death knell. My chest tightened as its shadow swallowed me whole. Behind me, Sophie's voice broke. "Dad, please." The bars pulsed with light, her eyes swam darker, and the guardian raised a hand the size of a coffin lid. If I fought, I risked becoming part of the tower myself. If I didn't, Sophie's cell would seal forever. I clenched my fists, stepped into the guardian's shadow, and chose wrath. The guardian fell upon me like a history lesson written in violence. Every swing of its chain fists carried centuries of battlefields, bronze spears crashing against shields, musket balls tearing through smoke, mortars pounding mud into graves. Its movements weren't random. They were the choreography of every war man had ever fought. When it struck, I felt the stampede of cavalry in its blows. When it blocked, I heard the ring of iron clashing at Gettysburg. When it drove me backward, the echo of Hiroshima burned behind my eyes. Wrath was not just its nature. Wrath was its arsenal. I fought back with everything I remembered from a younger man's body, grappling, striking, desperate survival. But every punch I threw sank into its smoke flesh and vanished. Every kick landed only to be swallowed by its chains. I was fighting the history of anger itself, and losing. The guardian's strike sent me sprawling, ribs screaming. My lamp clattered across the stone, flickering. Sophie cried out from behind the bars, fists bloody from pounding. "Dad, stop, you can't out-wrath it, that's what it wants." Her voice dragged me back from the edge. Wrath answered wrath, but love had never been its weapon. I staggered to my feet, not raising fists this time, but raising my voice. "You don't get her, she's mine, she's my daughter. And I'll never stop loving her, not when she lies, not when she kills, not even when her eyes go black." The guardian reeled, its hood twisted like smoke in a storm. I stepped forward, palms open, not to strike but to reach. "You hear me? You've cataloged murderers, tyrants, executioners, but you don't know what a father feels when his daughter calls his name. You can't archive that, you can't own it." I grabbed its wrist, chains freezing against my flesh. Instead of resisting, I pulled it close like I was holding a child. "You can keep wrath, but love belongs to me." For the first time, the guardian faltered. The black hollowness in its hood quivered. My embrace crushed inward, not through strength but through defiance. And the entire tower shuddered as if a new entry had been written. Not wrath, love. The guardian collapsed into itself, chains slithering to the ground like dead serpents. From the husk of its chest spilled a shard of metal, jagged, shining, unmistakably a key. The bars of Sophie's cell dissolved in white fire. She stumbled out, skin pale, eyes still inked with black but burning with recognition. I caught her, pulling her against me. For the first time since her death call, I held her alive in my arms. "Dad," she whispered. I pressed the key into my pocket. "We're getting out of here." We ran down the spiral, through the echoing cells, past the city of violence, its gunfire dimming behind us, until at last the copper river spread before us again, the current of years rolling slow and thick. The ferryman waited, boat steady, his hood tilted toward us, unreadable. One passenger crossed, his gravel voice rasped. "Now to return." I gripped Sophie's hand tighter. "We'll pay." But the ferryman shook his head, poles scraping the current. "One toll, one price, 2 souls, 2 prices, not 7 years but 14, paid in flesh and breath, shared or taken." Sophie's grip on my hand went rigid. My own chest tightened with the weight of it. 7 years had already been stolen from me. To carry her home, I'd have to lose another 7, or she would. And the ferryman was already waiting for an answer. The river spat us out into the Mammoth Cave like a tide that had never been water. The stone tunnel yawned behind us, then folded into silence as if it had never been carved. Sophie clung to me, her breath ragged, her eyes still filmed with that ink-black tint. But she was alive. I should have been celebrating. Instead, the truth landed like a weight in my spine. When we stumbled back into the Kentucky morning, the first rays of sun fell across my hands, and they weren't the hands I remembered. Wrinkled, lined, a stranger's hands. The ferryman's tax was written into my skin, a decade stolen. Overnight, I was older by 10 years. Every movement reminded me of that theft. My back ached deeper, my lungs scraped harder, but Sophie looked untouched. Thin, yes, shaken, but still 24. It was me who had aged for both of us. We didn't make it to the car before we saw them. Black SUVs parked off the service road. Men in suits, not local cops, not park rangers. They wore DHS pins, but their posture was military, their silence worse than any uniform. A woman led them. Sharp suit, hair cut close, glasses that didn't quite hide the watchfulness of someone who had slept in too many safe houses. "Mr. Carraway," she said before I introduced myself. "And Sophie, welcome back." Sophie stiffened. Back from what? The woman ignored the question. She gestured, and her team moved with a precision that told me they'd been briefed on us for months. "OS," she said, as if the acronym should mean something. Office of Esoteric Security, where the division Homeland keeps in the dark even from itself. I swallowed. "You knew. About the gates." Her smile was too thin to be comforting. "We've been cataloging them since before you were born. Revolutionary field maps, WPA shaft, sealed mines. You didn't think you were the first to fall through, did you?" Behind her, one of the men held a black case. When he opened it, I saw photos, surveillance prints, me entering Mammoth, Sophie weeks earlier walking with her satchel. They hadn't just known, they had watched. The woman studied Sophie's face, then my hands, as if checking for cracks in porcelain. "You came back," she said softly, "and you're not corrupted. That's unusual." Sophie's jaw tightened. "Unusual how?" "Most don't return. Those that do aren't themselves anymore. They bring something back, voices, shadows, hungers. We usually have to put them down." She let the words hang like a noose, then added, "But you walked wrath and returned human. We've waited years for a case like this." Her glasses caught the dawn light, hiding her eyes. "We want you both to work for us." I laughed, hoarse, cracked, half delirious. "You want to recruit the grieving father and the half-possessed daughter." "Exactly," she said. "Because you've already proven you can go where no one else can and come back intact." Sophie gripped my arm. Her fingers dug in, her eyes blackened just slightly at the edges. "Dad, don't trust them." But the woman only smiled colder. "Trust isn't necessary, only results." She nodded toward the SUVs. "Get in. We'll explain the next gate and what we need from you." The sun rose higher. I felt the weight of stolen years on my bones. Sophie's shadow trembled against mine. And for the first time since that voicemail, I realized escaping the tower hadn't been the end. It was the recruitment. They flew us in black window vans, not planes. No signage, no base insignia, just an empty warehouse at the edge of Virginia woods. Inside, it was something else entirely. A federal site that didn't exist on any record. Not on maps, not in deeds, not even in whispers of appropriations. The floors were painted with concentric circles, each ring marked with symbols I recognized from Sophie's atlas. The walls were lined with observation glass, but I never saw who was behind them. They called the place Camp Ashfall. We trained in silence. Days on end running obstacle courses where the obstacles bled. Weapons that fired salt, not lead. Lectures on colonial sigils, on WPA architecture, on what happens when thin places go unsealed too long. The instructors never raised their voices. Their calm was worse than yelling. They spoke as if we were already enlisted in a war that most of the country would never know existed. And the truth was, we were. One evening, the OES lead, the same woman who had met us at Mammoth, slid a field manual across the table. Its cover bore nothing but a number, 72. Inside was the map, not just Mammoth. Other gates pulsed like open wounds. Carlsbad Caverns, NM, an entire chamber sealed behind false walls. Nevada Test Site, a crater that never cooled, humming with more than radiation. Brooklyn, NY, a basement under a tenement, bricks sweating ink. New Orleans, LA, a parish where hymns warped into screams at midnight mass. Minnesota Iron Range, a mine shaft where voices still work the seams though the town died in 1953. Yellowstone, not the geysers, but a vent where steam rises with the stench of burnt hair. Each site was circled in the same colonial hand Sophie had discovered, ink preserved like it refused to fade. "We call it the Hellwork," the lead said flatly. "Every gate is a job site and the work never ends." Sophie leaned forward, black still curling in her irises. "So you just keep sending people in until someone doesn't come back," the woman replied. "Then we send another." Our first assignment came sooner than I wanted. A rescue op. They called it. 2 grad students had slipped into a shaft off Carlsbad. Their GPS tags were still pinging, faint but alive. We were given a map, ropes, and a phrase: "Close what you can, bring out what breathes." The descent was almost routine after Mammoth. The air smelled of salt and bones, the limestone slick with centuries. Sophie led, headlamp steady, her voice sharp with confidence she didn't have before. Then we reached the chamber. The GPS pings flared ahead, overlapping. The grad students had to be close. But as Sophie opened the field manual to confirm the path, the ink shifted. Lines rearranged themselves. Corridors bent into new directions. Entire chambers vanished from the page, replaced by others. The map was rewriting itself as we read it. Sophie's voice broke in the beam of her headlamp. "Dad, it's changing." The tunnel we'd marked as safe now ended in a red sigil we hadn't seen before. The route to the pings curled like a serpent swallowing its tail. The grad students were alive somewhere ahead. The map promised that much. But the only way forward was a path that hadn't existed 30 seconds ago. I looked at Sophie. She looked back at me, black-eyed and pale. And together, we stepped into a passage the world hadn't written yet. At Camp Ashfall, they didn't brief us with pep talks. They handed us numbers. OES analysts filled screens with graphs and scatter plots. Seismic spikes, EM flares, air pressure drops. The correlation that tied them together wasn't geology, it was awareness. "When nobody knows about a gate," the lead explained, tapping one graph, "the pressure is stable. But the moment stories circulate, folk tales, podcasts, Reddit threads, the line ticks up. The more people believe, the thinner the seal becomes." Sophie leaned forward, eyes sharp. "You're saying knowledge opens them." "Not knowledge," the analyst corrected. "Attention." He pulled up a historical overlay, 1930s WPA shaft surveys, flatline, Cold War rumors, small bumps, the digital age, vertical spikes. The more the world watched, the hungrier the gates became. The analyst clicked again, showing clips from our Carlsbad mission. Our body cams, blurred by OES filters, flickered across the screen. "Notice the anomaly," he said. The footage slowed at the moment Sophie and I pulled one of the grad students free. A pulse rippled through the limestone, faint but measurable, like a heartbeat cracking open. "That's not rescue," the analyst said. "That's rupture. Every extraction tugs at the boundary. Every life brought out drags something else closer to this side." I gripped the table. "You're telling me saving them made it worse?" "Worse and necessary," the lead replied. "We can't just leave them, but don't pretend the barrier doesn't pay a price. There's no such thing as clean extraction." Sophie's hands trembled on the desk. "So every time we help, we open it more." The lead didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was confirmation. We were still reeling when another alert ripped through the ops floor. Screens flared red, alarms drilling through the walls. "Sensor cascade," an operator shouted. "Brooklyn Gate EM spike off the charts." On the main screen, a live stream loaded, not from OES feeds, from YouTube. A man in robes, face hidden by a bone-white mask, was broadcasting from the basement under Brooklyn. His followers, dozens, maybe hundreds, crowded around the sweating brick. They weren't afraid. They were chanting. In the corner, a view counter ticked upward like a Geiger counter gone mad. 10,000, 50, 100,000. Sophie whispered, "They seeded it. They're spreading it." The analyst's voice cracked over the din. "Every view is pressure. Every click weakens the gate. They know exactly what they are doing." The live stream zoomed in on the brick wall where ink bled like veins. The chanting blurred into static. At Camp Ashfall, our instruments screamed, sensors maxing out, needles snapping past the red. The OES lead turned to us, pale for the first time. "This isn't just pressure anymore. This is rupture." The basement wall in Brooklyn pulsed once, twice. And on the third pulse, the live stream cut to black. After the Brooklyn rupture, OES went into lockstep panic. Briefings turned into war rooms, screens covered in red spikes, maps glowing like wounds. That's when they showed us the document. It wasn't new. It was dated 1947, stamped with the seal of a decommissioned bureau I'd never heard of, something called the National Paranormal Containment Office. The plan was blunt. The title page read, "Project Final Seal, Destruction of the 7 American Gates." The proposal called for simultaneous detonations, sacrificial wards, and sealing rituals older than the Republic itself. The kind of thing bureaucrats bury not because it doesn't work, because it works too well. But the last page was the one that chilled me. A handwritten annotation scrawled in red ink. "Only way it holds is if the seal bleeds. 7 anchors. 7 lives bound." OES lead didn't soften it. She pushed her glasses up and said flatly, "Every seal needs a living tether, a guardian. The energy doesn't stick to stone, it sticks to flesh. Without anchors, the doors reopen. With anchors, they close for good." Sophie paled. "You mean people?" "Not just people, volunteers," the lead said. 7 souls willing to be woven into the gates. They don't die exactly. They persist, part human, part threshold. I felt my stomach turn. A prison sentence, not death. Eternity as a living lock. The analysts had already modeled it. 1 guardian per gate, 7 in total, anything less and it collapses. The room fell silent. Nobody breathed. And then Sophie broke the silence. She stood. Her voice was thin but steady. "Then Mammoth is ours." Every head turned. My heart stopped. She looked at me, black still swirling faint in her eyes, and said, "It started with us. It ends with us. If someone has to hold the Mammoth Gate shut, it should be the ones who opened it." I shook my head. Sophie, no, you don't know what you're saying. But she was already walking toward the OES lead, hand out, sealing the deal. Mammoth is ours, she repeated. And I realized too late the decision had been made. They moved us into a secure encampment at Mammoth. Quarantine tents, concrete bunkers, satellite dishes rising like thorns above the karst. The cave mouth was lit by flood lamps that never switched off. We weren't alone. Visitors came, quiet suits, polished shoes, handshakes that smelled like power. Not OES this time. Men from Rayleigh Systems, a defense contractor with Pentagon ties. Their spokesman smiled too broadly, like he was selling insurance. You two have done remarkable work, he said, nodding to Sophie and me. But let's be honest. Containment is only one option. Utilization is another. He slid a folder across the table, diagrams, energy yields, drafted language about biotemporal advantage and non-conventional deterrence. In plainer words, weaponizing the gates, harnessing what lay beyond for national superiority. Sophie slammed the folder shut before I could answer. You can't be serious. The man only smiled wider. Young lady, America didn't become great by ignoring resources. If that wasn't enough, OES briefed us on another problem, the televangelist. His name was Pastor Caleb Brand, broadcast out of Dallas, but his face filled screens from Alabama to Oregon. He preached fire and blood, miracles and salvation. And someone dug into his finances. Buried among the donations were payments to shell companies, companies leasing property near the Brooklyn Gate and the parish in New Orleans. The televangelist wasn't just preaching miracles. He was funding reopenings, stage managing heavenly signs for his flock, buying faith with the very ruptures OES was trying to seal. Clips of his sermons filled the war room, flames bursting from a cross in Baton Rouge, a statue in Brooklyn weeping tar, congregations crying, proof of God. Sophie whispered, they don't even know they're worshiping the gates. And she was right. Between the defense contractors pushing for weapons and the televangelists staging miracles, OES was outnumbered. America wasn't united against the gates. It was fractured. Competing agendas grinding against each other like tectonic plates. And in the middle of it, Sophie and I were being pulled tighter into Mammoth, where we'd volunteered as its anchors. But the factions weren't content to argue in conference rooms. They wanted leverage. They wanted us. The attack came in the dead of night. I woke to the smell of cordite before the sound. Then the rattle of suppressed rifles, the crack of flashbangs bouncing off rock. Floodlights snapped black. Sirens cut off mid-wail. Shadows swarmed the camp perimeter. Sophie gripped my arm, eyes flaring dark. Dad, they're here. Through the cave mouth, I saw the time strobe red on a dead monitor, 3:17 a.m., and the first armed figure breached our cavern, rifle up, shouting. Sec Mammoth, secure the gate. At 0400, the plan came down from OES command. All 7 gates had to be sealed within 1 hour. No staggered operations. No second chances. The timing wasn't mystical, it was logistical. If one gate closed and the others stayed open, pressure would surge sideways, blowing seams across the country. But the tools weren't relics of faith. OES was careful about that. No crosses, no relics, no desecration. They had learned the gates fed on fanaticism. Instead, every site was anchored with artifacts of human promise, secular and tangible. At Carlsbad, a miner's helmet that had saved a trapped partner in 1912. At the Nevada test site, a glass marble kept from Hiroshima, carried by a veteran who swore his children would never see war. In Brooklyn, a copy of a rent ledger showing a landlord who forgave debts during the Depression. In New Orleans, a brass trumpet that had played through hurricanes to keep neighbors calm. In Minnesota, a union charter signed after strikes ended without bloodshed. In Yellowstone, a ranger's badge from a man who gave his life in a 1988 firestorm, promising to hold the line. And at Mammoth, in Sophie's trembling hands, a faded postcard from my late wife, mailed the day she promised our daughter would always be safe with me. 7 objects, 7 vows, not religion, the OES lead said through the comms. Just human contracts, promises kept, that's what the gates can't counterfeit. The ritual wasn't Latin, it wasn't chanting, it was synchronization. Every site went live on the hour. Agents placed artifacts into the stone mouths. Sophie pressed the postcard against the carved sigil at Mammoth. Sensors hummed. Pressure gauges dipped for the first time in decades. Brooklyn's wall stopped sweating ink. Carlsbad's air cleared of rust. Yellowstone's vent cooled, steam turning white. On the control screens at Camp Ashfall, red lines softened to amber. For the first time since Sophie's voicemail, there was hope. "It's holding," an analyst whispered. "It's actually holding." I felt her hand squeeze mine. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible that the final seal could work, that Sophie and I wouldn't be prisoners forever. But hope never lasts long in the Hellwork. The tremor came under our boots, slow at first, then sharp enough to rattle helmets from hooks. Sophie gasped. The postcard in her hand blackened at the edges, flames that weren't flames eating the paper. Behind us, the limestone wall at Mammoth groaned, a sound like a rib breaking. A fissure ripped across the carved sigil, jagged and wet. On the comms, other sites shouted panic, but I only heard one thing. The well at Mammoth was cracking open, and something was knocking from the other side. The crack in Mammoth wasn't just stone giving way. It was a skyline rising. Through the fissure, towers climbed, brickwork of shattered rifles, windows glowing with muzzle flashes. The city of violence clawed upward, its streets paved in blood-colored current, its alleys filled with voices that never stopped screaming. We had glimpsed it once across the Copper River. Now it wanted more than glimpses. It wanted arrival. Every shot fired, every hand raised in anger, every war story retold fed mortar into its walls. And America had never been short on violence. Sophie staggered back as a tower pushed through the karst, bullets ricocheting from windows that weren't windows. "They're climbing," she gasped. "Dad, they're climbing through." Then, above the gunfire, above the grinding stone, came a sound I never expected to hear again, the steady dip of a pole in water that wasn't water. The ferryman. He rose in the fissure, raft sliding on that copper current, hooded head bowed. Last time he had demanded years from me, stolen a decade from my body as payment. Now he reached out, skeletal fingers brushing my sleeve. "Debt returned," he rasped. And in my chest I felt the stolen years collapse back inward. My breath came stronger, my hand steadier, my spine straighter than it had been in 20 years. I was whole again, if only for this fight. The ferryman shoved his raft sideways into the rising street, blocking the tower's climb. For the first time he wasn't taking, he was giving. Sophie's black-tinged eyes widened. Why would he? But I knew, every coin has 2 faces, even death keeps its bargains. We held our ground while the ferryman forced the city back, stone shrieking, skyline shuddering like a beast denied its meal. For a heartbeat, I thought we might survive Mammoth's cracking well. Then Sophie froze. Her gaze turned toward the cavern's inner chamber, the place carved with the warding sigils where the throne of the guardian had always stood empty. Only now it wasn't empty. A figure sat there, motionless, hands folded on knees. Not the ferryman, not one of the dead. Something new, something waiting. Sophie whispered, "Dad, the guardian came back." The figure lifted its head. Weeks passed in a haze of debriefs, psychological evals, and long silences broken only by the scratching of pens. OES insisted we write everything down, not memoirs, not confessionals, but manuals. How to resist the whispers. How to negotiate with the ferryman. How to endure when the sigils burn. Each section was stripped of poetry, reduced to steps, diagrams, procedures. A handbook for the next anchors, whoever would follow when we faltered. Sophie hated it. "We're turning survival into policy," she muttered. I reminded her that's what soldiers do, that's what parents do. You don't just survive, you leave something behind, so we wrote. One afternoon, a researcher burst into the tent where we worked. "You need to see this." He replayed footage from the threshold, the 7-tunnel chamber we had first crossed. 3 spectral soldiers, blue, gray, and ragged, had always been there, locked in eternal debate over Antietam. But in the footage, as Sophie and I wrote our manuals, they began to fade. Not violently, not torn apart, simply exhaling like burdens finally lifted. By the time the camera looped, their voices were gone, leaving only dust on stone. Sophie whispered, "We freed them. Somehow, writing it down, making it teachable, untied them. We didn't know what debt we'd paid, only that something trapped had been released without us meaning to." That night, the camp's calm shattered. Sensors screamed across OES's network. Alarms strobed in every control room. Technicians scrambled, reading data that shouldn't exist. 7 gates, one shouted. It was always 7. On the map, a new dot pulsed. Not Mammoth, not Carlsbad, not Brooklyn or New Orleans or the others. A fresh wound blinking cold blue. Coordinates, Lake Superior. Depth 1,300 feet. Status, unmapped. An 8th gate. Sophie gripped my hand, the manuals trembling between us. "Dad, what if we've only sealed the first chapter?" The lake's dark surface stared back at us from the screen, flat as glass, hiding something older than any of our manuals could prepare for. The alerts faded. The red strobes dimmed. The world for once did not end. But the work didn't stop. Anchors don't retire, they keep the night. So Sophie and I stayed in Mammoth in a cavern where the stone still bore cracks from the city that tried to climb. Flood lamps burned less bright now. Guards rotated, researchers filed in and out, but for us, time grew quieter, stretched thin across the watch. People called us heroes. They whispered guardians. But what we really were, what we remained, were 2 souls who had survived and promised to survive again if it meant keeping the doors from breathing. We learned something the analysts never wrote in their graphs, something no sensor could chart. It wasn't technique that had closed Mammoth. It wasn't even the artifacts of human promises. It was love. The same love that let me fight the guardian in the Tower of Wrath when no blade or bullet worked. The same love that had pulled Sophie back from the brink when the gates tried to ink her eyes black. Love didn't just beat wrath. It bound the seals. Every oath, every artifact, every manual we left behind, they were all just echoes of that same truth. That's what held the stone, that's what held us. The nights are long in Mammoth. Sometimes we pass them with stories, sometimes with silence, but often with chess. The board is scratched from travel, the pawns mismatched. Sophie plays black, I play white. She's better than me, always has been. We sit across from each other, moves quiet in the glow of lanterns, while the door behind us hums softer and softer. Until one night, as I castle my king, the hum falls away completely. The silence is so sudden it feels holy. Sophie looks up, eyes clear, no darkness in them now. She smiles, not triumphant, not fearful, just alive. And in the stillness of Mammoth Cave, a father and daughter keep their watch, while the door that once swallowed America finally, mercifully, lies silent.